7 chambers, 7 empires, 7 kings, popes, and queens whose private rooms became the worst-kept secret in their kingdoms and whose appetites destroyed everything they built. What happened inside these rooms was never written down on stone tablets. The historians who recorded them were silenced. The architects who built them were paid to forget. But fragments survived, in private letters, in confiscated diaries, in the shocked confessions of guards who saw what they were never meant to see. A Roman emperor who turned an island into a private cult of pleasure. A pope who hosted 50 courtesans in the Vatican while his own daughter handed out the prizes. A king of France who built a hidden chamber behind a mirror at Versailles, where young women were brought and never seen again. A Russian empress who collected an entire museum of erotic furniture and made every diplomat in Europe walk through it. These chambers were not metaphors. They were real rooms, with real doors, real keys, and real witnesses. The kings and queens who built them believed they were untouchable. Inside those walls, they were. But every empire is built on the shoulders of people who had to keep secrets. And eventually, the people stopped. This is what happened behind 7 of the most forbidden doors in history. The orgies, the massacres, the disappearances, and the rooms where empires died. In the year 27 AD, the second emperor of Rome did something no emperor had ever done. He left. Tiberius Caesar, adopted son of Augustus, ruler of the largest empire in the world, boarded a ship in Naples and sailed to a small island called Capri. He never returned. For the next 11 years, he ruled Rome from a cliff-top fortress called Villa Jovis, the House of Jupiter. It had 12 levels, carved into the rock face, with a 300-meter drop to the sea below. What happened inside that fortress is one of the darkest chapters in Roman history. The historian Suetonius, writing decades later, described what guards and freed slaves told him. Inside Villa Jovis, Tiberius had a chamber called the Seraglium. It contained a series of pools, rooms decorated with explicit frescoes, and a private library of erotic texts collected from across the empire. Tiberius would have young men and women, many of them noble children sent to him as gifts from desperate Roman senators, brought into the Seraglium. According to Suetonius, he trained them to perform what he called minnow swimming, slow, choreographed swimming routines in the warm pools. The chamber was kept dim, lit by oil lamps that flickered against the marble walls. When Tiberius grew tired of a guest, a senator's son who had fallen out of favor, a consul who had displeased him, he had them taken to the cliff edge. The drop was called Salto di Tiberio, the leap of Tiberius. Bodies were never recovered. The sea below was deep and cold. For 11 years, the elite families of Rome sent their children to this island and accepted the silence that came back. Tiberius died at Villa Jovis in 37 AD. The official cause was illness. The unofficial cause, recorded in 3 separate ancient sources, was suffocation. His chamberlain, allegedly with the help of his chosen successor, Caligula, smothered him with a pillow. His body was carried down the cliff he had built, past the chambers where he had lived for over a decade, and the people of Rome cheered when his ship arrived at the harbor in Naples. The pools were drained. The frescoes were chipped from the walls. But the chamber itself, carved into the rock, is still there. The man who succeeded Tiberius was his protégé. He had grown up watching what happened on Capri, and when he became emperor, he tried to outdo everything he had seen. Caligula, Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus ruled Rome for less than 4 years. In that time, he built 2 ships that historians still struggle to describe. They were not ships. They were floating palaces. Each one was over 70 meters long and 24 meters wide. They carried marble baths fed by lead-lined hot water pipes, gilded bronze mooring posts shaped like lions and snakes, mosaic floors depicting Olympic gods, and cabins with running cold and hot water. A system so advanced it would not be recreated in Europe for 1,500 years. The ships floated on Lake Nemi, a small volcanic crater lake outside Rome. They were Caligula's private chambers. And what happened on them, according to the surviving accounts of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, was extraordinary. Caligula brought the wives of Roman senators onto the ships. He would dine with their husbands, drinking from gold cups, watching dancers from Egypt and Spain perform on the lower decks. Then, mid-banquet, he would rise, take a senator's wife by the hand, and walk her into a private chamber on the upper deck. The doors would close. The dinner would continue. When Caligula returned, he would tell the husband, in front of the entire table, exactly what had happened. He would describe specific anatomy. He would compare. The senator was expected to laugh. Caligula's three sisters, Julia, Drusilla, and Agrippina, were also brought aboard. Suetonius writes that Caligula lived in habitual incest with all his sisters and openly displayed them at banquets. The ships were used continuously for the 4 years of Caligula's reign. On January 24, 41 AD, 3 officers of his Praetorian Guard cornered him in a corridor of his palace and stabbed him 30 times. They went next to his wife, Caesonia, and killed her. They took his infant daughter and smashed her against a wall. The ships sank to the bottom of Lake Nemi. They stayed there for 19 centuries. Mussolini drained the lake in the 1930s and pulled the ships out. They were displayed in a museum on the lakeshore. In 1944, retreating German soldiers set fire to the museum. The ships burned. What remains today is a single bronze head of Medusa, salvaged from one of the prows. In 218 AD, a 14-year-old boy from Syria became emperor of Rome. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he is remembered as Heliogabalus, or Heliogabalus, after the Syrian sun god he was raised to worship. He came to Rome with his grandmother, his mother, and a long train of Syrian priests and concubines. And he came with a vision. Inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Heliogabalus built a pleasure chamber unlike anything Rome had seen. The walls were lined with cloth of gold. The floor was strewn with rose petals so deep that, according to the Augustan history, he once smothered guests beneath an avalanche of falling roses released from the ceiling. Some guests, the chronicle records, suffocated in the petals because they could not push them away in time. What happened in the chamber was a deliberate inversion of every Roman value. Heliogabalus, dressed in silk gowns dyed in Tyrian purple. He wore a long blonde wig, styled like a Syrian prostitute. He painted his face with white lead and red ochre. He held public auctions of imperial offices, and he held them naked. Cassius Dio, who served as a senator under Heliogabalus and watched what happened from a distance, wrote that the emperor offered enormous rewards to any physician who could perform what we now call gender confirmation surgery. He wanted to live as a woman. According to Dio, no physician in Rome would attempt the procedure. Heliogabalus was married 5 times in 4 years. One of his wives was a Vestal Virgin, which, under Roman religious law, was a capital offense, punishable by burying alive. Another was a man, a charioteer named Hierocles, whom he openly called his husband. The Praetorian Guard had been paid to look the other way. By 222 AD, they had stopped looking the other way. On March 11, 222 AD, soldiers entered the palace. Heliogabalus was 18 years old. He hid in a latrine. They dragged him out, killed him, and killed his mother in the same room. They cut off his head, dragged his body through the streets of Rome, and tried to throw it into the Tiber. The body was too large to fit through the sewer gate. They weighed it down with stones and threw it into the river instead. The chamber was stripped to bare stone within a week. The Senate ordered every record of his name erased. In 1640, a man who had spent 25 years in a cage became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Ibrahim. He'd been locked in a 4-room palace called the Kafes, the cage, since he was 2 years old. Ottoman tradition required that all of a new sultan's male relatives be kept alive but isolated, in case the sultan died without an heir. Ibrahim grew up watching his brothers be strangled one by one. When he was finally summoned to the throne at age 27, he refused to leave his cage. They had to drag him out. 8 years later, the Ottoman Empire was in ruins. Ibrahim's pleasure chamber was inside the Topkapi palace harem. It was a series of interconnected rooms covered, floor to ceiling, in sable furs. According to Ottoman court records, he ordered every wall, every cushion, every divan upholstered in the dark fur of Russian sables. He bathed in basins of perfumed water. He ate from gold plates encrusted with rubies the size of pigeons' eggs. Every night, a new young woman was brought to his chamber. They came from the harem, from slave markets in Crimea, from the courts of vassals who hoped to win his favor. By 1647, the harem held over 1,400 women. What happened in the inner chamber was witnessed by guards, by servants, and by his own mother, Kursum Sultan, who tried for years to control her son and ultimately failed. In the autumn of 1647, Ibrahim heard a rumor. One of his concubines, he believed, had betrayed him with another man. He summoned his harem master and gave an order. 280 women were tied into weighted sacks. They were taken at night to the Bosphorus, loaded onto small boats, and dropped into the deepest channel of the strait. Only one survived, a woman whose sack tore on a fishing line. She was found alive by Greek fishermen and taken to a Venetian convent in Crete. Her account is the only first-hand record of what happened in the chamber. On August 8, 1648, the Janissaries, Ibrahim's own elite guard, surrounded the palace. His mother, Kursum, gave the signal. The Janissaries entered Ibrahim's chamber and strangled him with a silk cord. He was 32 years old. The sable furs were removed. The chamber was sealed. It can still be visited today. In 1492, the most powerful man in Christendom was a Spanish cardinal named Rodrigo Borgia. He bought his election to the papacy with bribes, took the name Pope Alexander VI, and moved his entire family, including his 4 illegitimate children, into the Vatican. His private apartments were on the second floor of the Apostolic Palace. They were decorated with frescoes by Pinturicchio depicting saints and Madonnas. Behind those walls, what happened was something the Vatican spent 5 centuries trying to forget. The chronicler was a man named Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. He kept a private diary, which was discovered after his death. In it, he describes an event that took place in the papal apartments on the night of October 30, 1501. It was called the Banquet of Chestnuts. Pope Alexander VI hosted the dinner. The guests included his son, Cesare Borgia, his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, and a select circle of cardinals. He also hired 50 courtesans from the streets of Rome, women known to the Vatican by name with established prices. After the meal, the courtesans were brought before the Pope. Burchard writes that they were ordered to remove their clothes and crawl on the marble floor among lit candelabra. Chestnuts were thrown across the floor by the guests. The women were instructed to retrieve them. Then the Pope, his son, and his cardinals announced prizes: silk cloaks, bracelets, coins of gold for the courtesans who could perform the most acts with the male guests in front of the others. Lucrezia, according to Burchard, sat beside her father throughout. She was 21 years old. Rumors of incest between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare circulated even in their lifetimes. 3 of Lucrezia's marriages collapsed under accusations involving her family. 2 of her husbands died violently, one strangled in his own bedroom on the orders, contemporaries believed, of her brother. On August 18, 1853, Pope Alexander VI died after a feast. The official cause was malaria. Cesare, who had eaten the same meal, fell into a fever that left him paralyzed for weeks. Most modern historians believe both men were poisoned, possibly by a cardinal they had been planning to murder first. The Banquet of Chestnuts was never officially acknowledged by the Vatican. Burchard's diary is still in the Vatican archives. In 1745, the most powerful woman in France was not the Queen. She was the King's mistress. Madame de Pompadour, born Jean-Antoinette Poisson, the daughter of a banker, became the official chief mistress of Louis XV when she was 23. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. She was also, by the time she was 30, no longer Louis's lover, but she remained for 2 more decades the most influential person of Versailles. Her tool was a chamber. Behind the public state apartments of Versailles, she designed a series of private rooms called the Petits Appartements. Hidden, mirrored doors, spiral staircases that opened into bedrooms, a bathing chamber where the walls reflected each other infinitely, a salon where every surface was either glass, gold, or rose-pink silk. But the most famous chamber she designed was not in Versailles. It was a private hunting lodge called the Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park. It sat in a discreet street in the town of Versailles, and it housed young women. The Parc aux Cerfs was supplied by Pompadour's network. She paid procurers across France to find young women, often from impoverished noble families, sometimes from among the daughters of palace servants, and bring them to the Deer Park. There they were dressed, taught manners, and waited for the king. Louis XV would visit, sometimes weekly. The women were told he was a Polish count visiting Paris. Most never learned who he was. When he tired of them, they were given a payment, a husband, and a small estate, and they were sent away. The exact number of women who passed through the Parc aux Cerfs is unknown. Estimates range from 100 to several hundred over the 20 years it operated. 2 of them bore the king children. Pompadour died in 1764, at age 42, of tuberculosis. She had become so unpopular in Paris that, when her funeral procession passed through the city, citizens turned their backs. Louis XV outlived her by 10 years. He died in 1774 of smallpox, contracted, court physicians believed, from one of the women at the deer park. 15 years after his death, the people of France stormed the gates of Versailles. The Parc aux Cerfs was burned. The Petits apartments were stripped of their gilding. The mirrors that Pompadour had hung were sold for scrap. The seventh chamber was assembled by an empress who outlived 4 lovers and ruled the largest empire in Europe. Catherine the Great, born a minor German princess, became Empress of Russia in 1762 after her own husband was murdered, almost certainly with her knowledge. She ruled for 34 years. She built the Hermitage Museum. She extended Russia's borders into Crimea and the Baltic. And in a private wing of her palace in St. Petersburg, she built a chamber unlike any in European history. It was called the Erotic Cabinet. The chamber held a collection of sculptures, paintings, and furniture that Catherine had gathered, sometimes purchased, sometimes commissioned. According to the inventories that survived, it contained Roman erotica from Pompeii, Indian temple sculpture, Renaissance paintings, and, most famously, a complete bedroom suite carved with explicit imagery on every surface. The legs of the chairs were made in the shape of intertwined human figures. The bedposts were sculpted in detail that no print of the period dared to reproduce. Catherine showed the chamber to selected diplomats. Foreign ambassadors recorded their visits in private letters home. One Prussian envoy wrote that he had never seen anything like it in Europe, and that the empress, then in her 60s, smiled the entire time and offered detailed commentary on each piece. Her lovers were equally well recorded. 12 official favorites are documented, beginning with Sergei Saltykov when she was 24 and ending with Platon Zubov, who was 40 years younger than her when she was 61. Each of them was given titles, palaces, and serfs. Most were dismissed when she grew tired of them. None complained. The famous rumor that Catherine died attempting to mate with a horse is a fabrication invented by French revolutionary pamphleteers a generation later. She died on November 17, 1796, of a stroke in her bathroom. She was 67. The erotic cabinet survived her. It was preserved by her son, Paul I, who hated his mother but could not bring himself to destroy it. It survived the 19th century. It survived the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks cataloged it. Then, in 1941, the chamber and most of its contents disappeared. Some pieces, the rumor goes, were taken by retreating Nazi officers. Others were hidden by Soviet curators and never recovered. A handful of photographs survive, taken before the war. The chamber itself, in the Hermitage, is now a study room. 7 chambers, 7 empires, 7 kings, popes, and queens whose appetites destroyed everything they built. A Roman emperor on a cliff, a pleasure barge on a volcanic lake, a teenage empress smothered in roses, a sultan and 280 women in the Bosphorus, a pope and 50 courtesans in the Vatican, a king of France and the deer park, a Russian empress with a museum no one was supposed to see. The doors are closed now. The chambers, in some cases, still exist. You can stand in Tiberius's Seraglium on Capri. You can walk through the Borgia Apartments in the Vatican. You can buy a ticket to the Topkapi harem. The sable furs are gone, but the rooms remain, silent, stripped, and waiting. What happened inside them was hidden. Then it was forgotten. And then, because someone always writes it down, it became history. Subscribe for more.